Welcome back everyone. In this lesson, we are going to be looking at starting to set up our weapons. Now, our weapon system is going to be a very modular system, meaning that if we were to create, for example, a sword for the player, we create the animation to attack, as well as all the effects related to it. We should then be able to give the enemy the exact same sword scene and have them use it without any further code required. That is going to be our goal for this course, to be able to create a system where if we want to create a new weapon, we don't create it specifically for the player. We don't create it specifically for the enemy. We create it for a character to use, and then that character can then use that weapon without it needing to specifically be a player or an enemy. So that is what we're going to do. Now, the way we're going to do that is, again, with inheritance, as we've been doing so far with our character, our player, and enemy. And the inheritance tree for our weapon system is going to look like this. I know, it's quite a bit. Essentially, we're going to create a base script, a base class called EquipItem, which is going to basically keep track of all the basic stuff, such as running a function when it's equipped, running a function when we have used this item, also keeping track of things such as the angle it is aimed at, how often we can use it, as well as the character that owns it. And then from here, we can create some sub classes such as weapon, which is going to take into account things such as the range, the attack sound, what type of weapon this is. And then that weapon can then be split off into two further categories, such for melee weapon, which deals direct damage, and ranged weapon, which spawns a projectile that then deals damage. And also up here, we're going to have a shield item as well, which isn't technically going to be a weapon, but rather an equip item. So let's get started with our equip item first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder in my scripts here, and I am going to call this one weapons. And inside of weapons, I'm going to create a new script called EquipItem. Let's open that up. And inside of EquipItem, we are first of all going to make it extend from node 2D, because this is going to be something we attach to a node inside of our player and our enemy. And we'll give it a class name of EquipItem. Now let's start with some variables. We're going to have an export variable for the use rate, essentially how often can we use this item. We're then going to have a last use time float variable, which is going to basically tell us the last time we used the item so we can determine if we can use it again. We'll then have an aim angle variable, which is going to be the rotation that we want to apply to this item. And then we're going to have a variable called owner character. This is going to be the character who is currently in control and owning this item. And then a variable for can use, which is going to be a boolean, and it's going to be true by default. And this is just going to be something we can toggle. Some items you might want them to be able to use once, etc. Now let's lay out our functions. We're going to have the process function, which of course gets called every frame. And this here is just going to be used for rotating our item, our weapon over time. We then want a function for set aim direction, which is going to take in an aim direction parameter of type vector2. And this here is going to be called from the player and enemy script to basically point the weapon in its desired direction. For the player, this is going to be pointing the weapon towards the mouse cursor. And for the enemy, this is going to be pointing the weapon towards the player. We then want a function called equip, which is going to be called when this item is equipped onto the character. And this can then play an equip sound, or you might have some initialization you want to run. Likewise, we'll also have an unequip sound, or an unequip function, if you want to play some unequip sound or related code there. Then we need to have a function called try_use, and this is going to return a boolean variable, okay? And then finally a use function, and use is going to be what actually commands this item to do something. For example, if this is a sword, the use function is going to cause it to play the animation and attack. If it is a bow, it is going to cause the item to shoot a projectile. Now, let's begin filling in these functions, and I'm going to start with try_use over here. Now, try_use is going to be what's called by our character whenever they want to use the item, because whenever they want to use it, for example, whenever the player clicks with their left mouse button or whenever their enemy is within range, we don't want to be able to use the item every frame that condition is true. We only want to use the item if can use is equal to true, and if enough time has elapsed that we can then use the item. So here what I'm going to do is go if not can use, return false, okay, because if we cannot use the item, we want to return false. Likewise, we can then go if time.get Unix time from system minus the last use time is less than use rate, then we want to return false because not enough time has elapsed between the last time we used the item. Now, if both those conditions, we pass them, then we can use the item. So we can then go last use time equals time.get Unix time from system. We can then call the use function and then return true because we have successfully used the item. Now, use, unequip, and equip, these three functions are going to be what's known as overridden by its inherited classes. Now, that essentially means that if we have our weapon script, remember the weapon class which inherits from equip, let's just get rid of all this stuff here. So we have EquipItem and then we have weapon. Now, weapon inherits all the properties from EquipItem, so all these variables and functions we're creating right now, weapon will have those. And what we are then going to do inside of weapon is override some of EquipItem's functions, meaning that if we were to recreate the function with the exact same name, instead of it being called here in EquipItem, it's instead going to be called in the weapon script. And that allows us to basically customize the contents of this function depending on its subclass. Now, up here in process, let's go ahead and essentially rotate towards our aim angle. So here we'll just go global rotation equals lerp angle. Rotate from our global rotation towards our aim angle at a rate of 40 times delta. We're doing this and not just hard setting the direction because we want a bit of smoothness with our rotation. Likewise, down here with set aim direction, we essentially just want to convert this vector direction into a rotation. To do that, we can simply go aim angle equals aim direction dot angle. Just like that. Again, Godot has these very helpful functions for us to do that with. And there we go, that is our EquipItem class. Now, this is not going to be a script we are going to attach to any specific object. This is going to be what you could call an abstract class, a class that is only existing as a base to be then extended and inherited from. So in the next lesson, we are going to be looking at setting up our weapon, which is then going to be something that the player can use in order to attack with, as well as the enemy as well. Okay, so we'll be working on that in the next lesson. Thanks for watching. Welcome back, everyone. In this lesson, we are going to be creating a weapon that can be used by our characters. So first of all, we need to create our weapon script. So down here in my weapons folder, I'm going to create a brand new script, call it weapon. Now, if you remember from last lesson, I went over the fact that we have our base EquipItem class, which we already created, and then from that, we are going to create two inherited classes, weapon and shield. We're going to work on shield a bit later on in the course, so for now, we're just going to be focusing on weapon. And weapon is then going to be a generic class or a base class for either a melee weapon or a ranged weapon. So this base weapon class isn't actually going to be dealing damage and stuff like that. Rather, it's just going to contain the data required for doing melee attacks or ranged attacks. So inside of weapon, we're going to extend from EquipItem so that we can have all of its properties and functions. We're then going to give it a class name of weapon. And then what we're going to do is just create one variable, and that is going to be an export variable called range of type float, and by default we'll just make it 10. Now this range variable is really only going to be used by the enemy, okay, in order to determine how far away they need to be from the player to begin attacking. So we're not going to worry too much about that right now, but now that we have our weapon, let's go ahead and create another script, and this script is of course going to be our melee weapon, okay. This is going to be for things like swords, axes, anything that we want to hit and deal direct damage. So let's open up melee weapon now, and if we refer to the chart, as you can see, we then need to inherit melee weapon from weapon. So inside of melee weapon, we're going to extend from weapon, and we're going to give this one a class name of melee weapon. Now, this is going to be more specific to swords and axes, so we're actually going to have some variables here, starting with an export variable of damage of type int, and then an export variable of hit force, okay? Now, hit force is essentially going to be the amount of force that is applied to the character who gets hit by this weapon. So, for example, a sword, you might want to push an enemy back, but you might have a heavy axe, which does a lot more hit force. We then want to have two variables for our nodes. We're going to have one for our animation and one for our hitbox. We'll fill those in just a second. Then what we want to do is we want to create two functions. We want to create the use function, which we'll just pass, and then we're going to create the detect hits function, okay? And this here is just going to be called when we want to check to see, okay, what characters are inside of our hitbox. Now, you may notice that the use function here is the exact same name as our EquipItem's use function. So, if we have a variable that is referencing an EquipItem or a weapon, for example, and we call its use function, it is going to go down here and call whatever code is inside of use inside of EquipItem, which at the moment isn't anything. But if we have a script or a class that is inheriting EquipItem, such as melee weapon, which is actually inheriting from weapon, which is inheriting from EquipItem, and we create a function with the exact same name, whenever we call that use function, that is no longer going to be called on the base class, but rather it is going to be overridden, and this code is going to be run instead. Now, what happens if you want to run the code in here as well as the code in the base class? Well, you can simply call super.use, and that is going to call the use function basically one class up. So it's then going to call use inside of weapon. But we're just going to go past here for now, as we'll do the damaging a bit later on. Now let's go ahead and actually create our sword. Okay, this is going to be the weapon that we can use for our player or for our enemy. So, for the sword here, what we're going to do is we're going to create a brand new node 2D right here, and I'm going to call this one weapon underscore sword. Now, our sword weapon is then going to have that melee weapon script, so we can drag that on like so. We can give it some damage, maybe 1 damage, and then 150 hit force. Range, we might make that 30. We can modify this stuff later on. Then what we need to do is give it a visual. So I'm going to create a sprite 2D node, just call it sprite. And then inside of sprites, let's go down to items, item sword, drag it in, there we go. Now, the way that our aiming is going to work is we're going to get our weapon sword and basically rotate it towards our mouse cursor. Now, how do we know, or how do we tell it which way the sword is pointing by default? Well, by default, the forward direction or the pointing direction is going to be towards the right. So what we need to do is rotate our sword sprite like so. And then let's also go ahead and move it over a little bit because we don't want it in the middle of the player. So I'm going to set its X position to be 11. So it's a bit out. Now, if I rotate my weapon sword, you can see that's what it's going to look like rotating around the player. Okay, so we have our sprite. Now we need our hitbox, and the hitbox is going to be what's detecting all of the different characters it may hit. So we're going to go ahead and create a brand new area 2D, which is a physics body that can detect overlapping colliders. I'm going to rename this to be our hitbox, and then I'm going to give it a collision shape 2D, which we're just going to set this to be a rectangular shape. Okay, and I'm going to then move the hitbox over to around the tip of the sword here, and then just reshape it so it looks a bit like this, okay? Because what we're going to do is we're going to animate the sword sprite so that when it attacks, it's going to jump out like this, okay? It's going to jump out, so we want to cover pretty much all the area that we want this sword to cover, okay? So we'll just do something like this, I reckon, okay? There we go. So this is our hitbox. Anything that is inside of this, when the sword jabs, will be dealt damage to. But how do we get the animation actually going? Well, we need to create an animation player node. So I'm going to create an animation player node right here. And then what we're going to do is we essentially want to animate the sprite position property. So for this, what we're going to do is we are going to go down to our animation player, click on animation, new, and we want to give it the animation name of attack, like so. Now what we can do is zoom in a little bit here. We need to add a property. Now if we select our sprite, you'll see in the inspector all these properties have these little key icons. If I click on the key icon next to position, that is going to basically add a new track for this position property. Disable create reset track, we don't need one of those, and click create. And there we go. So now what we can do is animate our position over time. So we essentially want our sword to sort of charge back a little bit and then jab, okay? So I'll move it forward a bit here. We can actually change the duration. Let's make this a 0.5 second animation. Move it forward a bit here. And then I'm going to basically essentially just right click inside of the track here and go insert key. If I double click on that key, and then with that selected, we can go over to the inspector and change the value here. So we can basically charge that back a little bit like so. And then you'll see we have that animation now. We're going to hold there for a little bit. So I'm going to zoom in more here. I'm going to copy that key, move forward a bit, paste it. So it's like this. And then we're going to charge forward. So move it here a bit, create a new key. And this is then going to charge the sword forward like so. And then we'll copy, let's just see what that looks like that. We'll copy that one, paste that here as well, and then select the first key, copy that, and paste it back like so. Now we should have this animation. There we go, nice little sword strike like so. We can make the strike a bit more impactful by lowering the distance between these like so. Now it looks like this. There we go, a nice sword attack animation. And there we go. Now we have our weapon, and in the next lesson we are going to be going over finishing this up and then connecting it to our weapon controller. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you all then. Alright, welcome back everyone. In this lesson, we are going to be continuing setting up our character's weapons. At the moment, if I press play, you'll see that our character holds the weapon, but it doesn't look right. We can't attack with left mouse, and the weapon is not rotating to face our mouse cursor. So how can we fix this? Well, we are going to create a script that is going to basically be in charge of the character's weapon. Okay, it's going to equip the weapon, it's going to basically attack when we want to and manage everything like that, as well as the shield later on. So first of all, what we're going to do is save this weapon sword as a scene. So inside of my scenes folder, I'm going to create a new folder called weapons, and I'm just going to drag the weapon sword in like so and save it there. We can then delete the weapon sword here because we are going to spawn that in via a script. And then what we're going to do is on our player, create a brand new node 2D and call this one our player weapons. Just like that. And then we might also want to move it down vertically so it's around the center of the player's torso here, about where they'd hold it. Now, inside of our scripts folder, we are going to create inside of the character folder a new script called character weapons. Now, just like with player, enemy, and with everything else, this is going to be a generic script which is going to keep track of the weapons for both the player and the enemy. This is what that script structure is going to look like. We're going to have the base character weapons, and then from there, it's going to create player weapons and then enemy weapons. So, and the reason why we have these two separate ones is because they're both going to be attacking in different ways. The player is going to be attacking via inputs from the mouse and keyboard, whereas the enemy is going to be attacking based on distance from the player. So, inside of our character weapons script, we're going to extend from node 2D, and we're going to give it a class name of character weapons. Then what we're going to do is we are going to have an export variable here for our weapon to equip. This is essentially going to be the weapon that the character is going to equip at the start of the game of type packed scene. And then we're going to have a variable for our current weapon of type weapon, like so. And then we also need a reference to the character. So an onReady variable called character of type character. Now, since our player and our enemy are both sort of structured in the same way, we're going to also have an equivalent enemy weapons for the enemy here. Essentially, the character is going to be the direct parent of this node. So what we can do is simply go equals and then go $, and then in quotations 2 dots, and that is going to get the parent node. Now let's set up our functions. We're going to start with the ready function, which is just going to be used for equipping initially. Then we're going to have a function which is going to be called whenever we want to equip a new weapon. So equip weapon, and it's going to be sending over a weapon scene of type packed scene, like so. And then likewise, we also want the unequip weapon function, which is going to do the exact opposite. It's going to unequip whatever selected weapon we have right now. And then we also have ones for shield, but we don't really need to fill those in just yet. So here inside of ready, we're simply going to go if weapon to equip. So if we have a weapon to equip, then we're going to equip it here at the start of the game with the weapon to equip. Down here inside of equip weapon, first of all, we want to check to see if we already have a weapon equipped. So if current weapon, then we just want to unequip it. So unequip weapon. Then what we're going to do is we are going to instantiate this weapon scene. So we'll go current weapon equals weapon scene dot instantiate. We're going to add it as a child to our player weapons or enemy weapons node right here. So here we'll just go add child current weapon. We'll then set its position in case it spawns at a bit of an offset. So current weapon dot global position equals our global position. And then what we need to do is set the current weapon's owning character. So current weapon dot owner character equals the character that this weapons script is assigned to. And then finally, we need to call its equip function. So current weapon dot equip. And there we go. That's all we need to do. Then down here inside of unequip weapon, we simply just want to check to see if not current weapon, then return. Okay, so if we don't have a current weapon and somehow this function was called, then just return. Otherwise, we are going to go current weapon dot unequip. Oops, not unique name, dot unequip. And then we want to delete the node. So we'll go current weapon dot q3. And there we go. So that is everything for our character weapons script at the moment. Once again, we don't want to attach it to the player weapons node. Instead, we want to create a brand new script called player weapons. So we'll create a script here called player weapons. And this player weapons script is going to extend from character weapons. And we'll give it a class name of player weapons. And inside of here, we are going to create the process function. Now, inside of the process function is where we are going to be detecting inputs from the player. So first of all, we need to capture two things, the mouse position and the mouse direction. So we'll go mouse pos, and this is going to be equal to get global mouse position. And we need this in order to calculate the mouse direction. This is going to be the direction we want to point the weapon in. So here we'll go var mouse direction equals global position dot direction to mouse pos. Let's then add the data types here to be exact, so we know exactly what we're working with here. So these are all vector 2s. And yeah, then what we need to do is basically go, okay, if we have a current weapon, then we need to set the current weapon's aim direction to be the mouse direction. So current weapon dot aim, set aim direction to be mouse direction. Now, if I go ahead and run this right now, first of all, we need to attach our player weapons to this node here, and a weapon to equip. We want to set that to be our weapon sword. So at the start of the game, you should see that that sword is instantiated here, and it should then be pointing towards our mouse. So if I press play, and there we go. We now have our sword spawned in and it's pointing towards the player's mouse, which is very nice. Now we need to make it so that when we click, it will attack. So let's do that. What we're going to do is then inside the if statement is go if input.is action just pressed attack, not block, attack. Then what we're going to do is we are simply going to go current weapon dot try use. So it's going to call that try use function, which is going to attempt to use it. Now, if that is successful, then over on our weapon or on our melee weapon, the use function should be called. Now, what are we going to do here inside of use? Well, we essentially want to play that weapon's animation. So let's actually open up our weapon sword here. We need to get a variable reference to our animation player. So here I'm going to do an on ready variable called anim of type animation player, and this is going to be equal to the animation player, so we just drag that in. Let's do the same thing for the hitbox. On ready variable hitbox of type area 2D equals, and we'll drag the hitbox in like so. Now down here in use, we're simply going to go anim.play, and we want to get the animation name, which is attack, and there we go. Now if I press play, we should see if I left click, that animation is playing, which is very nice. And you'll see if I spam the left mouse button, it's only doing it every 0.5 seconds, okay? It's not playing the animation every time I click, which is exactly what we want. Now we want to make it so that whenever we attack, when the sword is thrust forward, we want to check the hitbox for any other characters that may be inside of the sword hitbox. And that's what we're going to do in the next lesson. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you all then.